Hello everyone, it's your curator Kevin Atkinson coming to you live at 5 with another Cranbrook Architecture and Art History Tour. Today's tour we are going to be looking at Cranbrook Academy of Art and its history through its architectural history. And so, lucky for us, Cranbrook Academy was built from 1925 until 2002 was the most recent building, and they're all built in sequential order. So we will be starting here at the entrance. We'll make our way down the street, we'll turn and head to the Art Museum, and then we'll end at the Rafael Mineo designed new studios building. Now, Cranbrook Academy of Art, like most of the Cranbrook campus, was the architectural design of Eliel Saarinen, Finnish-American architect. And his inspiration for the planning of the Academy of Art, he was looking towards Camillo Sitta, and he was looking towards Venice and the plan of the Piazza San Marco. And so the Academy of Art is an L shape, just like the Piazza San Marco. Most of it is on the long stem of the L. That's Academy Way, where I was just standing. And along Academy Way, we find the student dormitories, the student studios, the faculty housing. We also find the workshops, the metal shops and wood shops and casting studios and ceramic kilns. And then on the L, the shorter end of the L, that is where Saarinen planned his museum, his formal gardens, as well as some of the unbuilt aspects of the Academy of Art, like a school of horticulture, a school of drama, a school of music. Saarinen, when he received the commission, was told to build and plan for a much grander academy, a much grander enterprise than what would end up being built. So just to start us out on a little bit of history here, Cranbrook is of course the living legacy of our founders, George and Ellen Scripps Booth, who made their fortune. First, George was an iron worker and made a fortune in the iron business, and then the real money behind Cranbrook was Ellen's family money, and her father had founded the Detroit Evening News, and George was the first manager and then publisher of the News. And George Booth was involved in the arts and crafts movement from the late 19th century. He got really dedicated to it around 1905, 1906, when he became the founding president of the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. He helped establish the Society's art school in 1911. After that closed in 1918, he helped start the second Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts school in 1924 or 26, thereabouts. That's now the College of Creative Studies. But in 1923 or 1922, George Booth ventured out to Rome. And when he saw the American Academy at Rome, he got a new idea for an art school in the American Midwest. And he was impressed at the American Academy in Rome, how the artists were not necessarily students, they were advanced artists who were studying in depth the field, and they were sort of learning from each other. They were learning from the history of Rome and the Roman museums. That they weren't taking classes. It wasn't an apprenticeship. It wasn't a place where you went to learn art. It's where you went to perfect your art. And that really is the Cranbrook model. And so he comes back to his property here in Bloomfield Hills. He started construction on Christchurch Cranbrook. He started construction on Cranbrook School for Boys. And finally in 1927, he creates the indenture trust for Cranbrook Academy of Art. And the buildings that they were using in those earliest years was the first Academy building. Originally, this building was just called Cranbrook Academy of Art. Then it is now known as the Administration Building. And this was designed not by Eliel Saarinen, but by George Booth's youngest son, Henry Booth, and Henry Booth's best friend from architecture school, J. River. Let me turn off Wi-Fi. He and Henry Booth and Bob Swanson had traveled together through Europe on a grand tour in 1922. And so when they designed this building, they're right out of the University of Michigan, where Eliel Saarinen had been their instructor during the last year. And Eliel Saarinen is consulting on the building. Meanwhile, they are consulting both Saarinen, but also their sort of travels through Europe. And you'll see how this building incorporates old pieces of stained glass and different sort of European medieval revival style building. Now, in the earliest days, this was actually meant to be garage spaces. Upstairs was the sculpture studio of Geza Marotti, who was sculpting the architectural ornament for the boys' school next door. Eventually, this building would be taken over by Eliel Saarinen, who ran the Cranbrook Architectural Office out of these lower windows here. At its height in 1930, when Saarinen was designing the Academy, Kingswood, and the Boys' School, Saarinen had about 24 mostly young Michigan graduate architects working for the Cranbrook Architectural Office, designing Cranbrook. In this wing of the building, the original art library was on the lower level, and the first art museum was upstairs. And the best feature of this building, the most delightful feature, is the crane here, which is added in brick and then also in broken pipe. And so these are actually drainage pipes down here that were smashed and then laid out in this sort of pattern. These are roofing tiles from the School for Boys that was under construction around the same time. And then we have the form of the crane. Cranbrook Old English for where the crane lands. And the crane is our sort of mascot here for the campus. You'll also see the rich variety of Dutch-style bricks, including these clinker bricks, where you see explosions of mineral deposits making irregular forms. After 1925, in the fall of 1925, Eliel Saarinen ceases to be a consultant for Cranbrook, and he becomes our resident architect. And he serves in that position until his death in 1950. And so the first building that he designs from scratch is directly across the street from us, the Arts and Crafts Studios. And these buildings are designed from 1928 to 29. And very shortly after that, most of Cranbrook is built in about 17 years, but this part of the campus just burst forth seemingly overnight. In 1930, the Arts Club, which had kitchens and dining room as well as dormitories for the artist, was built. That same year, 1931, Saarinen adds an addition onto the administration building. And so he turns the Booth Swanson designed L into a Z-shaped building and begins establishing this sort of urban condition on Academy Way. Saarinen, back in Finland, had studied architecture and painting. He also was an urban planner. And here at Cranbrook, his title, he was always head of the Department of Architecture and Town Planning. And so he views Cranbrook as a little town, and it has this really beautiful urbanity to it, especially when you think about the fact that all of this is built in the middle of farmland, in the middle of nowhere, Oakland County. And so he establishes the street at the center, the row of trees, originally American elms, all killed by the elm blight in the 70s, the common garden wall that borders all of the buildings, and then each building has the same 2-story height with a common roof line, a common setback from the street, and then a common sort of rhythm of windows and gables all the way down. And so it feels like a little European city. And in his earliest buildings, he's very much working out his client's idea of ideal architecture. And so it has this English arts and crafts manner that was the passion of George and Ellen Booth. And from the English inspiration, Saarinen establishes this enormous variety of architectural forms and ornament, different ways of patterning brick. You see here at the art club entrance the way that Saarinen is layering the columns, which then have the pilasters behind it, and then there's the niche at the dead center. And it makes this sort of rhythm as it moves from column, pilaster to niche. And if we look closely, you'll see that Saarinen's using two different sizes of bricks. You have the flatter, more Roman brick for the columns, then you have the wider brick for the wall, and then you go back to the narrow brick for the niches and pilasters. And that enhances these moves all in one material, but you begin to see these lines and this rhythm established. If we look back across at the administration building, you'll see that he runs the sidewalks and they actually are narrowing towards the other end. So it extends this lawn going back with Carl Millis's Triton at the center. And then there is this charming English cottage, which was built to house Studio Eliel Saarinen. And Mrs. Saarinen was a sculptor in her own right. She studied sculpture in France at the Académie Colarossi. She then moved back to Finland, her native Finland. She fell in love with her older brother's business partner and became Mrs. Saarinen. In Finland, she was a sculptor, she was a furniture designer, she was a designer of windows and lighting. One thing, she was not a weaver. When she came to America, however, and Cranbrook was starting this arts and crafts village, our more Episcopalian, Puritan gender norms, she took up the mantle of weaver, and she was the first woman to be head of a department here at Cranbrook. And she did that by importing immigrant Swedish weavers to come and weave underneath her and run the studio, while she sat at the helm of this really modern industrial design studio, weaving not only for Cranbrook and for her husband's buildings, but taking other commissions as well, including weaving for Frank Lloyd Wright. And so she worked out of this door where Elliot Earls now works, and she had her private office sitting here where she could look out over the gates. These are Gary Griffin's gates from the year 2000. But she could look out over this little wall, and I love the subtle detail of brick modulation that Saarinen deploys. Not only do you have some bricks popping out of the wall, where you can see the shadow in the late afternoon sun, adding dimension to this wall, but it also picks up snow in the winter, like a Japanese garden, which has intentional ledges to create lines of snow. Saarinen pulls and pushes bricks to create shadows and snow lines. And then one of my favorite details, you can almost imagine Loya sitting inside her office with her quiver and arrows ready to protect Cranbrook with this sort of lancet going up. And then here you see narrower bricks, so you get 4 courses of bricks within the larger double course. On her studio, we see limestone ornament and these decorative columns that are really Art Deco more than arts and crafts. But again, if your client says he wants arts and crafts, Saarinen gives him arts and crafts with no sort of medieval detailing, only these Art Deco elements. And up there you see perhaps a chicken, more likely a peacock, in limestone on the chimney. And then as we move past, we're moving past the built-in water fountain, as well as additional limestone decorations. And then we turn the corner into the courtyard. And as we turn the corner, notice how this wall jogs back and forth, and it sort of seems rather irregular. One thing that Saarinen felt was that his buildings should appear as if they had grown over time. And so nothing at Cranbrook is really perfectly right angled. All of the buildings are turning and twisting different directions very subtly. So that's sort of, 87-degree difference. But instead of having a sharp right angle, it becomes this slightly obtuse angle. And on this side of the chimney, we see the dog leaping across its 2 limestone pillars. And then within this pentagonal courtyard were the original arts and crafts studios. And before there was Cranbrook Academy of Art, there were these studios that were craft-based. They were master artists with apprentices. They were commercial studios, and you could come to Cranbrook and buy fine silver, fine bookbinding, fine blacksmithery, fine weaving, and silversmithing. Yeah, silversmithing, bookbinding, blacksmith, weaving. And you could come into the studios and you would find these artisans hard at work. Unfortunately, this model, which George Booth envisioned, did not survive the Great Depression. And so in 1931, the arts and crafts studios were closed, except for Mrs. Saarinen's, because hers turned a profit, so she kept operating. And these buildings became the start of Cranbrook Academy of Art. And so in the corner where you originally had the silver shop and the bookbindery, eventually Charles Eames would open the design department in that corner. Over here, the silver shop extended into the basement, as well as the weaving rooms and looms. This is where Eames would have lived. The dormitories throughout this wing of the building. And then over here, the original blacksmith shop. And then by the early 1930s, the ceramics department had opened there, first with Wayland Gregory and then Maya Grotel. And as we look across these buildings, again, we see enormous variety in the way that Saarinen frames windows, where you have more sort of purplish Roman brick framing these windows, and then standard brick here. This change came in 1931 when Saarinen opened the architecture department at Cranbrook in these rooms here with these large glass windows. And then I love on the Arts Club this decorative leaded glass window here, looking into the stairway. Today, this is the Department of 2D and 3D design. So if we want to think in more pedestrian terms, graphic design and product design, but don't let them know I said that. 2D and 3D design. And Cranbrook, of course, is still a living and working art academy. And so while we started with our roots in the crafts, by 1932, our focus was painting, sculpture, and architecture. Design is incorporated shortly thereafter. Today, we are 11 divisions with painting, sculpture, architecture, 2D, 3D, and 4D design, photography, print media, fiber or weaving, ceramics, and metal smithing. So you can still apply and come to Cranbrook, and these buildings are still being used as studios. Now, in the center of the Arts and Crafts Court, what we now call Maya Grotel Court, after the famed ceramicist, we have this column, which has a Roman 2nd century column capital. It's missing the god Orpheus by Carl Millis. We're waiting to try and restore the top of this 1800-year-old capital so it can support the very large bronze figure again. And I think Saarinen places this here to sort of mark space and also to bring history into this campus. It has this medieval English quality, and then right at its center, it's anchored by this large traditional architectural column. The roofs here are slate. These are the only slate roofs at Cranbrook, and you will notice that they are graduated with the larger slate tiles at the lowest level and then smallest at the top. This is enhancing our sense of height and sort of scale of these buildings, but it's also necessary for the structure. You need lighter slates at the top and heavier slates at the bottom, or your lower slates will simply crack under the pressure of the upper roof. And all of these buildings are load-bearing masonry walls with timber-framed roofs and then slate atop it. And here we have one of the great works of American masonry, the basket-woven barrel vault of the Arts and Crafts Studio. And here, Saarinen is weaving the bricks across the top, focusing our attention on sun glitter, which was Carl Millis's 1918 sculpture and the first of 71 Carl Millis sculptures that George Booth purchased. But why did the vault have to be woven like this? Well, the entire passageway is actually a perspectival trick. It is narrower on this end than it is on that end. And in order to achieve that with load-bearing masonry, Saarinen would either have had to use trapezoidal-shaped bricks that were getting smaller towards this end, or he would have had to lay the bricks in this basket weave pattern. And that means that when you look back from the entrance of the academy towards the archway, you see the bricks. You don't just see a sort of dark opening, but you see the thickness of the walls, and you understand this great masonry vault. Now, we'll keep moving along because we have lots to see on our tour today. Here is a crane who is drinking from the lake. Here is a deer from Carl Millis. And as we descend this fabulous double stair, we are lined up across another axis with two Greek sculptures there. And all of Saarinen's planning for Cranbrook is this series of axial relationships that are slightly askew, leading you through art objects, through pathways, through landscape, from one element to the next. And then when you turn along this axis, you understand the scale of the academy as we look up towards the Art Museum of 1942. And that will be discussed a little bit later on in our tour. But from here, you have this wonderful vista, which should have water flowing. Maybe when we reopen, we'll have the water back in. And Saarinen frames this vista through the landscaping that Mrs. Saarinen designed with the horse chestnuts and then the arborvitae and then the water in the center. But I can't walk straight to the museum. I get pushed to the side. Much like at the Taj Mahal, the landscape shapes how we move to that building in the distance, and it also creates different framed vistas, because as I move to the pathway where I can process up, I lose the view of the art museum, and then I'll be reintroduced to it with a very different perspective, a very different sense of scale, a little bit further up the path. Now, on the other side is the original entrance where the Walter Nichols gate designed by Saarinen with boars by Millis welcoming you in. And this gate was the original entrance to the academy where in the earliest days, the public had to parallel park along Lone Pine Road. And on days, the few days that we were open to the public, you would cross the grass and there were stone pavers in the threshold. And then you'd be in this sort of world apart. And one of the fun things about the Saarinen campus design is that without using any sort of signage or instructions, he uses the landscape and the architecture to shape where the public can and cannot go. And so where I'm headed now, you would never think to walk up here unless you sort of live here and are meant to be on these pathways. And so here we come out of the wood and we're in another symmetrical pathway. And on our right is Saarinen House. On our left is the other side of the architecture department. And as we move across, you'll see decorative ironwork done in the Cranbrook blacksmith shop for Saarinen. This was Saarinen's architectural studio, and he could walk across and he could check out his students in their architectural studio. And just observe this sort of frame as we walk backwards along the pathway, and the way that it mirrors not only the entrance to the Arts Club, where you had the columns and pilasters, but it's also the art museum. Tall, narrow columns with a flat roof above, and then this large vertical opening. And I love the way that the walls are solid brick on the far side, and then the sort of open ironwork, brick and limestone steps on the near side. As we turn and look at the vines of Saarinen House, we'll keep moving along. Now that the sun is out of our eye, perhaps you can see Saarinen's addition to the initial Art Academy building a little bit easier, where he uses zinc infilled panels to create essentially an Albert Kahn factory, where you have these large walls of glass letting in air, light, and sort of open space for the artist studios, and then this membrane of a brick structure in front of it, and then these metal panels. It is like a Detroit factory of art making in this arts and crafts skin. Now, as we look back at Residence 1 and 2, this was the Saarinen's residence. It is now a museum. And then next door, attached to it, Residence 2, was the Millis's residence. And Millis was a Swedish sculptor who came here in 1931, stayed here until 1950. And Saarinen's house doesn't call attention to itself as the most important building on the block until you really get to the details. This was built to be the president's residence. He was head of this experimental art community, and so he needed to live in a place that looked like more distinguished than the rest of the Art Academy. And so if you notice, the second floor windows have leaded glass designs. The gable of the house as well has this decorative diamond pattern. And then when you get to the front door, you step up this telescoping pathway that leads into the door, which has two different widths of muntins used to support the glass, which has this sort of telescoping form. And then you'll see that even the gable, the bricks are telescoping, they're lining back. And even when you get to the top corner, there's another detail of the brickwork. And as you look along the side of the house, you see the way that he turns the bricks on headers and stretchers to create decorative designs that create this sort of dado line across the largest windows. And then at Millis's house, they are attached in that most unusual, un-American way. It is their duplex here, 10,000 square feet between the two houses. But notice Millis's house has a different corner detail, different second floor windows, different brick gable design up at the top. And this is where the current director of the Art Academy, Susan Ewing, and her husband live. Let's see, what's next? So we've covered the earliest end of the street. This building was originally the Headmasters House for the School for Boys. The headmaster never lived here, and so it was renovated by Henry Booth in 1946 and is now faculty housing. The model of the Academy's education is that the students don't take classes, they don't have lectures, they don't get grades, there are no direct assignments. Instead, the students work alongside master artists in residence, and they share studio space, and then they share critiques. They talk about art, they talk about each other's art. And so the faculty live here with their families, and the students live here, everyone sharing studio space, and it is this sort of country club of art if you're having a good day, a pressure cooker of art if you're a little stressed. And so on this side of the street, we see housing from the later 1930s, much simplified, copper roofs, aluminum framed windows. I want to turn down another passageway. Remember what it looked like between the architecture department and Saarinen's house? Now we have, instead of a portico linking, we have these two stone marble columns. Again, architectural fragments, or what we might call architectural spolia, borrowed from some other, most likely European source, and then installed here by Saarinen. And on one side, we have Millis's studio, which, unlike Saarinen's studio, which had normal windows, Millis gets this huge glass shed of northern light. And then he could walk from his attached home studio into his first of 3 private studios, where he did not teach, he simply existed here. He had lots of assistants, and he always maintained his studios in Sweden and in Rome. Sometimes he was only here once, 1 month a year. But he had this whole complex. So you see here OM for Olga Millis, Mrs. Millis's gate into their private garden. And then on the other side, we see CM for Carl Millis. And this was Carl's private studio and then larger studio behind. It really was the life. If anyone has questions, I'll try and read them as we wander. We're going to have about 15 more minutes of the tour. Now, as I exit this little pathway, we're passing by a sadly broken Saarinen gate, and then through two signs of spring. Here we have the Young Fawn by Carl Millis, carved in granite. And there you see Carl Millis's signature, the CM. And on the other side, we have Pan, who is the god of merriment and spring, relaxing there, half fawn, half god, human. And then this was Millis's main studio of 1931. When Millis was here, it was just a 40 by 80 foot room. So you can see here it's a 2-story building. In Millis's time, this was one room. It was just 40 feet high. And it seems quite a gloomy building, but in fact, this wall of all brick on the other side was a wall of all glass. And so he got east-facing light, and then in the afternoon, he had indirect light. Now, Millis's studio connects from 1931 to 1936 to the women's dormitory, or Dorm 2. And notice that we've had a change in the brickwork, and you see the way that the bricks are sort of weaving into this pattern where you have the grid of lines that connect both the aluminum frame windows and across the whole facade. It does read like a textile. And then the stairway at the end has these glass blocks that transition around an acute angle to the front glass block. Now, by this point, it's 1936. Saarinen's architecture is becoming more streamlined, less decorative, so there's no more leaded glass windows. Instead, we have the glass blocks and then these wonderful square bricks forming sort of tic-tac-toe boards across the facade. But he's doing the same pattern where it appears that the building is telescoping out. And on the side of the dorm entrance, Carl Millis's running horse sculpture is placed on a Saarinen-designed pedestal. And so you have this beautiful alignment of the windows on one side, the entrance at the center, and then Millis's sculpture with this great blank backdrop. There is no visible wiring. All of the wiring is running in tunnels underneath us. They're not big enough for humans, but they are big enough for our utilities. And there is an Edison Electric substation that George Booth had built in 1908 for his own house. I'm not sure, I don't think we have our own substation today. And there are unbuilt projects. I don't think that there are any unfinished projects here on campus, but the entire Art Academy is unfinished to Saarinen's most ambitious design, which we'll talk about when we get to the front of the art museum. Now, as we head through this great space, we have on one side the brickwork of 1931, which notice the bricks are quite beautifully irregular, but the mortar lines are all identical. When we come to the 1936 building, this is the only part of the Art Academy that has this, but notice that the mortar lines are actually incised on the horizontal. So these lines are incised, and then the vertical mortar lines are kept flush with the brick. This is a trick that Frank Lloyd Wright quite used in the quality of the building. It makes those horizontal lines much stronger as you move across. The roof has also changed to a copper from the initial slate. Saarinen House has a ceramic tile roof. And then you have the back of the painting studios where you have these square windows that seem, oh, the studios must be so dark and gloomy. But in fact, these studios have walls of all glass on the other side. And so, like the building behind me, you have northern expanses of light, so that the sun in the winter, when it's very low in the sky, it is behind the studio, and the sun, when the sun is very high in the sky, it's still behind the studio. So you can paint or sculpt, and you never have harsh, direct sunlight like this. You always have that indirect light. And I do quite love this glass steel curtain wall here because it makes me think of the Bauhaus of 1919, which Cranbrook is often compared to the Bauhaus. Saarinen was no socialist, nor was he a particular revolutionary. And so Saarinen's architecture, though Cranbrook opens a year before the Bauhaus closes, and it has these similarities, I think that both Gropius and Saarinen are looking towards the same sources. They're looking towards the industrial architecture of Albert Kahn, and they're borrowing these great steel frame windows. Notice by 1939, the steel frame windows have gotten much larger, and you have just 4 panels of glass for the lower studios, 3 or 6 for the upper studios. Huge single pane glass windows for the painting department. And these look out back across at Cranbrook Art Museum. And some of you who have been with me for a long time know that the Art Museum, I have done a tour of its sculpture earlier in the Facebook Live at 5 tour. So here I'll just talk about its architecture somewhat. It is in this stripped classical style where you have Saarinen. He is using this very traditional arrangement of the museum that we can trace to John Sohn at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. We can trace it to Schinkel at the Altus Gallery, the Palace Galleries of Paris, a large stairway leading to a columned entrance that is higher than the rest, and then lower wings for the gallery. But of course, Saarinen strips away all of the traditional ornament and sort of anything identifiable as classicism, and instead he keeps the proportions, he keeps the scale, and then he makes it something truly unique. We might call it stripped classicism or Scandinavian classicism, walking up this wide stairway with bullnose stairs that are actually kept quite low so that you can sort of glide across them. Saarinen liked to say that American salad plates were too small and our stairs were too high. And because he designed everything from our salad plates to our stairs, we have large salad plates and little stairs. And Saarinen really does conceive of Cranbrook as this total work of art. And so he designs everything. He designs the landscape with his wife. He designs the layout of the campus with the consultation of George Booth. He designs the buildings. He designs the interiors, the furniture. He designs the rugs with his wife and the furniture with his children. He even designs our logo. He designs our uniforms. He designs the doors. It really is this complete architectural environment that embodied what he thought the role of the architect was, which was someone who designed every item from the next largest to the next smallest scale. And so here at the museum, which is built of this Mankato Casota limestone, you have the enormous bronze doors, which have this sort of abstract pattern. They look almost botanical, growing left and right. And then as we turn the corner to the other side, notice the library doors have a similar botanic pattern, but now they're growing up and down. And it's this balanced asymmetry that we've seen throughout the tour today. Saarinen never does something that's truly symmetrical. And so you see that the library door is inset in the panel with St. Paul being converted within the frame, asymmetrically placed on the entire wall. And then notice on the museum side, you have the library door centered on this niche, and the sculpture, which is now missing, an Egyptian sculpture, is placed outside of the frame. And then the text, the ceiling, the architectural ornament, which is the series of sort of cryptic lines, all in that same language, this abstract geometric patterning. On this front of the museum, it is a museum with two fronts and no backs. We have the circular Orpheus fountain, which is again by Carl Millis and sculpted for a site in Stockholm and then installed here in 1939. The museum wasn't finished until 1942. And so the sculptures, the landscape, the pavement, everything was installed before the actual building was constructed. In the earliest days, these brick pavers were actually grass that had to be hand cut. And on this side of the museum complex, we have the Arts Library, which has these narrow stone windows. It is again a stone and brick load-bearing building, so the brick walls are holding a steel roof, but there is no steel vertical element. And so this sort of Gothic narrowness to the windows is because this is still a load-bearing wall. So those are narrow stone columns supporting the roof above it. Again, all north-facing light, bringing light into the great book collection, which of course connects back to the painting studios. So the courtyard we were just in, we're there, and it connects on to the dormitories. And so you have this very long axis that runs across the entire 300-acre campus, but you also have the Art Academy existing essentially as one superstructure with no expansion joints, but just one connected stone and brick structure from Lone Pine Road all the way to the end of our tour, which we'll head to now. Now, this axis predates Saarinen's immigration to America in 1923. It actually is coming from the early landscape plans of George and Ellen Booth. And so George Booth's house is straight ahead with the red roof. And his gardens, his formal gardens, headed due west, and Saarinen picks up George Booth's axis, runs it through the woods, clear cuts the trees, and then up the steps past this Chinese dog who is almost 2,000 years old from the Wei dynasty. It's actually a Chinese lion. And then the axis continues all the way across to that side of campus. Now the lighting is pretty harsh right now, but we're getting a sense of the way that Saarinen's architecture really cuts like butter the sun as it comes in and creates these striking shadows. And part of the reason that Saarinen selected this golden Mankato limestone was that it does have this warmth. And so even on a cold winter day, the buildings seem to glow. And then once we're down below, we see the way that Saarinen envisioned guests approaching the museum through the landscape, up the ramp of the Chinese dog, and into the museum straight ahead. Again, with the decorative ceiling, the load-bearing block masonry walls, and then the bricks. And these bricks were actually not meant to be permanent, so the building was meant to be expanded a couple of different directions. On one side of the Orpheus Fountain, Saarinen proposed building a series of dormitories and apartments. Here you can see that square. This is no longer a decorative brickwork. This was actually a segment where Saarinen proposed blowing this wall out, crossing over a colonnade into an expansion to the museum. On the other side of the ramp of the Chinese dog, Saarinen proposed building a dining hall, which is where the collections wing was eventually built. So this would have been a glassy dining hall. Now, as time moved on, Saarinen passed away in 1950, and his proposals for the Academy to have a dining hall and to expand in multiple directions were left unrealized. The Academy really doesn't build anything. It builds a new forge, a new kiln in the 60s. But by 2002, when the new studios opened, it was cramped. We had expanded from a sort of limited number of craft-based studios to 10 departments. The students famously in ceramics would make their pieces in the kiln because they couldn't get them from their studio down the 20-inch stairway into the kiln. So they made them in the kilns and then passed them out the window. Other students would have to cut their work in half to get it through Saarinen's little corridors. The metalsmithing department had 6-foot ceilings. It was tight. Things were tight. And so in 1991, Rafael Mineo, the Spanish architect, was hired to build this new studios building. Through fundraising issues and a number of different delays, it wasn't constructed until 2000, and the students moved in 2002. And part of the budget constraints were the elimination of a steel window wall here. So imagine this being steel curtain walls, not aluminum frame. But it's that same language of all northern glass. And now we have 3 levels of 12-foot, 8-inch studios, weavers at the top, fiber, ceramics in the middle, and metalsmithing down at the bottom, arranged by almost metaphysical weight, with the heaviest arts, the forges down in the basement, and then the weavers with their looms up at the top. And then the building is anchored on this side by what Rafael Mineo called the factory. It's clad in lead-coated copper, so don't lick any of our buildings, but especially don't lick this one. And the factory is where sort of hot art takes place. So you have the forge for the metalsmiths down in the basement, the kilns for the ceramicist here, and then dye rooms for the weavers up at the top, and stainless steel chimneys, which are meant to be architectural elements. And it connects to the museum complex with this wall of glass, and then what Mineo called the knuckle, where you see the brick connecting to the art museum. And that's a 3-story stairway space. And bear with me as we walk around to the other side of this building, and we'll end looking at the way that Mineo really completed Saarinen's vision for the Academy of Art. When Mineo visited the campus for the first time in 1990, he said he had read so much about Saarinen. He thought he understood Saarinen. He thought he knew Cranbrook. But what he was so struck by was both the diversity of Saarinen's architecture over his career and the sort of sublime beauty of the site. And of course, the modernist movement had eliminated discussions of beauty as sort of valid as architectural goals. And Mineo sought to add to this chain of distinct different parts of Saarinen's architecture another link. So Saarinen never designed a metal-clad building, but Mineo thought, if Saarinen was designing in 2000, why wouldn't he have designed a metal-clad building? The art museum is so different from that charming English quadrangle of the arts and crafts studio. Now, at the corner of Mineo's building, as at the corner of the Academy's education, are the artist in residence. And so here is the artist in residence of fiber, ceramics, and metalsmithing, and they sit as cornerstones in the architect's own term. And so they have their private studios. The factory is behind them with the crit spaces where the students present their work in all glass there. And so the faculty is right at the corner. And let's see if Iris is home. So you can just see into the studio space of Iris Eichenberg. And then the students, there are 16 studios each, about 120 square feet. And on this side, just like Saarinen studios, it is a brick wall with smaller rectilinear windows. Now, in its initial, more expensive plan, the building was not only 4 feet longer, but it also was going to be built of load-bearing brick, which you can see, unfortunately, was not realized. So just always look at this building from a distance and don't realize that the bricks are panelized. They are real brick, they're just not actually supporting any weight. And then here at the corner, what Mineo called the knuckle is this great cubic form where you have the window of the student studio, what is called the forum, sticking out, clad again in leaded copper, and then above it you have a museum gallery with its window sticking out. And so you have the museum, then the students, the academy, and they're forever linked as they are in real life. The Academy of Art Museum is part of the academy. It's not its own independent museum. And so you have this 3-story studio. Because it is lower on the site, the 2-story museum, Mineo was adamant that he not grow higher than it. And then you turn and you see the completed quadrangle. Now, Saarinen never proposed developing the campus in this direction. He would have grown it further to the north, but I do think that Mineo's extraordinary respect of Saarinen's architecture and the way that he slightly buried his new studio's building create this really seamless environment. You'll also see how he uses the red brick to offset art making from art viewing. So the red brick is where art is made, and then golden brick is where one learns about art. Whether it is starting in the library on the left, reading the history of art, or moving across the peristyle to the right and seeing the history of art in what was originally an encyclopedic museum. Then the students come down, they descend the stairways, they head into the studios, and they make the next history of art. Thanks so much for joining me on this perhaps ambitious tour of the architecture of Cranbrook Academy of Art. I hope that everyone is safe and well and healthy, and that you're all staying home. If you'd like to support the center, it is that time of year where we're asking for support to our annual fund. So if you're enjoying these tours, if you've been able to join us in person for events before the shutdown, we'd love to have your continued support of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. It's the department that I serve as curator of. It's our division of archives, architecture, historic house museums, and collections. So your support goes to things like polishing all of our Millis's bronze works, to maintaining our archives, to publishing digital initiatives like this. Thanks so much for watching. Next week, we will have a tour on Wednesday live at 5 of Cranbrook House, the Albert Kahn designed manor home of George and Ellen Booth. Who knows what's going to come after that? There's so much more to see and to learn about here at Cranbrook. Hopefully I'll be able to, as restrictions are lifted, get inside more of the buildings, and I hope to do a tour of the interiors of these studios, the museum, all of the different treasures of Cranbrook. George Booth and Ellen Booth built this place as a place of continual growth and expansion, in a place where art would be a living thing in our daily life. And so I think it's wonderful that I am able to, while we're all staying at home, continue the legacy of our founders and share with you the really special and magnificent place that was built here in suburban Detroit. If this is your first Live at 5 tour, thanks so much for joining us. You can find all of the tours under our video tabs, and we also do shorter, more in-depth tours with single objects and single buildings on Tuesdays and Thursdays on Instagram. Thanks so much for watching and sticking with me. I hope that you're all well. Be safe. I will put in the comments our page where you can help support the center and support this magnificent legacy. Be well, everyone.